Hello, everybody out there in Facebook Streamland. We are just live. We are starting live. We are super excited for this conversation. We've been planning this for a while. So, welcome to What's the Big IDEA? What's the big idea? We are going to be talking about how we support our families, how we support our students with special needs during COVID and after COVID. This episode is about introducing us, telling a little bit about our stories, and then going into what are your rights? Kind of like a 30,000 foot overview of here's what your rights are. So we're going to start by introducing ourselves, telling a little bit about ourselves. My name is Zachary Wright. I have been a teacher for a long, long time in Philadelphia for about 15 years. I started off my teaching career when in Brooklyn as a special ed preschool teacher. A couple years ago in 2012, my wife and I, Laura, we had our first son. His name is Leo. He's right there in the picture there. That's when he was younger. He's 7 now. He's going to be 8 on Thanksgiving. When he was about 3.5, he was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Prior to that, Laura, myself, we had zero really experience. Personally, zero experience. Some professionally with me with teaching, but I would not consider myself a special education teacher. That's not my wheelhouse. So when we got the diagnosis, it was a rug was pulled out from under us. Our entire world shifted and changed and has been forever changed from that moment. One of the things I remember most about when we first learned about Leo was one that Laura knew all along. That Laura, my wife, she knew something was up all along. And people didn't listen to her, including myself. They didn't listen to her. But she knew. Another thing I remember were the things people said when Leo got his diagnosis. They would say things like, but he's perfect. Or they would say things like, you can't tell. Things that I know came from a place of love, but were not what needed to be said at that moment. Since then, we've come a long way, getting the services we've needed, fighting for the services we need, demanding the services that we've needed, navigating a world that was brand new to us. And one of the things that we're going to be doing over the course of these conversations is trying to make that experience less traumatic for families, less dependent on who you know and what you know. So that is me. I'm going to pass it over to Chioma.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chioma Oru, and thank you, Zach, for that. My story is not so dissimilar from yours, but I'll just get into a bit of my journey and then what I've done since starting my journey. Again, my name is Chioma. I'm the mother of 2 sons with autism, Ati and Jedi. They are 9. Well, he's 10. He turned 10 in August, and my brain's still trying to catch up. 10 and 7 years old. Both diagnosed after the age of 5. And we're going to talk about why that was. Atulegu, my oldest, Ati was identified at 2, but did not get a diagnosis until he was 5, which is not uncommon for Black boys because they're typically mislabeled, or there's just this pressure to wait to diagnose, which is a huge error, and is a big part of my experience. So again, both my boys got diagnosed around the same time. And so that really shaped my entire life, shaped my employment life. I ended up having to resign from my job, and it really pressured so much in my family, including, unfortunately, causing a lot of stress between me and their father, which ended in a separation, even though we co-parent right now. But along the journey and through rediscovering myself, particularly what my vision was for life. Because how it was shaped by my sons, I couldn't keep regular hours. I had to make a lot of appointments. I had to manage their care, which in and of itself is a full-time job. So I just needed to reorganize. So I resigned from my job in DC government, which was a big decision, and a conscious decision, although it was still economically stressful, and spiraled me down the path that lots of families go through, having to get on social services, face homelessness, and really also went through a lot of mental pressure that led to me needing to address my own mental health, because I was just breaking down. There's no other way to put it. But in the building back up of my life, I found myself needing more autonomy in space. I've been in advocacy for a few years, working at Advocates for Justice in Education, which is an education law firm in the District of Columbia's Parent Training and Information Center, which every state has a Parent Training and Information Center, which is a mandate by the IDEA, and we'll talk about that as well. I've started my consultancy called Cheborn Free LLC, which is a company that promotes family-centered care, which is a big part of the disability rights movement and what a lot of families have been asking for over the years, not just in education, but in healthcare, in recreation, in any space through the systems of care that families navigate. It is very important to center it around families because it's the most humanitarian way to ensure equity and to ensure that the needs of the people are accommodated. As a Bright Beam activist, I work in partnership with 5 parent leaders, which is through the Parent Advocacy and Action Team. And we have started a show also on education, Citizen Education Network, soon airing, which is called Pat Down 202, which is a storytelling series that we use to advocate by inviting key leaders in the DC education space to engage us on their advocacy journey and in conversation around racial equity and disability rights in the opportunity gap that is wide, huge, gaping. And we'll get into that too. And the disproportionality of kids that, particularly Black and brown kids, that do not graduate from high school or do not finish their education journey at all. Some drop out. Some come out with a certificate of completion, but it's a bad outlook for students with disability, and no one seems to be in uproar about that. So we're making a bit of fuss here in DC. And I also have another show with a group of moms who are also advocates of parents with kids with disabilities. Some of them are part of the Parent Advocacy Action Team, others are not. And we have that show also soon airing on the Citizen Education Facebook, which is called We the Motherhood. And it's a true experience where we informally gather and talk about key issues that impact families, DC families and education, especially Black and brown kids with disabilities and their families. Thank you. So I'm going to pass it on to Joy.
Hi, my name is Joy, and I am an author, poet, and spoken word artist from Oakland and Berkeley, California. I was born with a hearing loss. I had an umbilical cord wrapped around my neck at birth, and that caused me to lose my hearing. Because fortunately, they detected my hearing loss at 15 months. Well, like at 6 months. I've been wearing hearing aids since I was 15 months. And so the thing was that back then in the 80s, there wasn't a lot of awareness about deaf, hard of hearing children. And so my mom, they intervened by giving me hearing aids, and I've been able to learn speech and I can hear. But the thing was, when I got into school, my mom was also somewhat of an educator because I come from a family of teachers. So by the time I got into a deaf hard of hearing program, I was advanced because my mom taught me how to read and write and everything at home. So I was in mainstream in a regular classroom, but back then I didn't have what you have an IEP, individualized education plan. We'll talk about that later. I was supposed to have a sign language interpreter and an assistive listening device, and Oakland did not provide that for me for a few years. And so after fighting, trying to get those services because I was mainstream without my accommodation, my mom we moved to Berkeley. And as soon as we moved to Berkeley, I got those services within 2 weeks, which we were fighting for 2, 3 years in Oakland. And Oakland and Berkeley are right next to each other. So once I was in Berkeley schools, I had all my accommodations. I excelled academically. And I went on, I went to Berkeley High, and I was mainstream. I didn't go for the California School for the Deaf, but I chose to be around regular students. So I ended up graduating from high school and going straight to UC Berkeley and getting my BA in African American Studies. And then I went on to get my master's in education at Stanford University. And so I am aware of the system of the IEP. And then as a parent, my daughter was mislabeled with autism. And I was fighting the school to say that she didn't have autism because I had her assessed by the East Bay Regional Center, which is a specialized organization that assesses students with special needs. They said she didn't have autism at 2 years old. So the school psychiatrist assumed that my daughter had autism, and I said, no, she doesn't. And they wouldn't listen to me, and they override the decision of East Bay Regional Center. And so my daughter was mislabeled as having autism when she really had another type of disability, which was auditory processing. It took for her to recently transfer to another school, and they had her triennial IEP, and they assessed that she didn't have autism, which I already knew. So I learned how to be an advocate because I watched my mom advocate for me, as well as um, I learned to advocate for myself. And now here I am advocating for my daughter. And yes, she does have a learning disability, but she overcame it. And I'm trying to teach people how to fight the system when they're trying to tell you something else when you already know they're not right.
So what I'm hearing in all of our stories is that there's a power structure. That there's a power structure here wherein the families, even if they do come from a family of education, they are at a natural disadvantage because when they go into schools or they go into social services, they come from a disadvantage of either knowledge, background information, or power, where often they are told the wrong thing. They are not told their rights. Families don't know what they are entitled to, what their children are entitled to. And as happened, I believe, in all of our stories, we are told the wrong things. We were told that Leo was anxious, and we were like, no, there's more there. We were told, well, once he had this diagnosis, like, okay, we'll put him into the autism self-contained room. It's like, you haven't even met him. Like, you don't know what he needs. Like, his academics are off the charts. Like, so he doesn't need. So what I'm seeing, and it's no surprise, is that there's an unbalanced power structure. And what we need to do is ensure that all families know their rights and can exercise those rights. So what I think we're going to do, and please interrupt me, tell me to shut up at any point, but what I think we're going to do is go into some very 30,000, altitude of 30,000 feet looking down. Here is the general landscape, because one thing that special education has is jargon. And it has jargon, and it has initials, and it has all these things that when you're a parent sitting down at the meeting and the teachers just throw these jargon around and you don't know what you're talking about, not only is it not useful, it is really disempowering and it really is silencing. So let's go through some of these key pieces of information and we'll just roundtable this one off. So we'll have a PowerPoint come on, and we're going to start off with this very, very, very umbrella term, the IDEA, which is where we get the name of our show, the Individuals with Disability Education Act. I'm just going to kind of go through these bullet points and then Joy and Chioma, fill us in on all your amazing expertise. So it was originally passed in 1974 and is amended periodically, most recently, I believe in 2004, but maybe earlier. And it essentially guarantees that all children with disabilities have available to them free and appropriate public education, FAPE, which we'll get to in another moment. And it emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet a student's need. And this law guarantees a student with disabilities a right to a special education that meets their needs. So that's the basic definition. But Chioma and Joy, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, thank you. I think that it's important to frame IDEA. I mean, people know it, people use it, but people don't know very much of the history of it, because just like we are parents advocating for the future of the IDEA, at the time, if you look at the timeline, 1974, when it was passed, it was named the All Handicapped Children Education Act. And then it was renamed in the 80s, which is when it was first reauthorized in 1986. Then it was reauthorized again in 1990. Actually, I think it got its current name in 1990. And then again in 1997, and the version that we use now is the 2004. And each reauthorization has brought in expansion. So in the 1986, it expanded to include early childhood, because the original IDEA didn't have accommodations for children birth to 3. And at that point, it was still the all handicapped children's with different alphabets that broke up the sections. But then when it was reauthorized in the 90s, it became Part C. So I think it was Part K or Part H when it was still under the All Handicapped Children's Education Act. And then it became Part C. So we more famously know Part C services now to cover kids birth to 3. And then the Part B services, there's Part B 619, which covers kids in preschool, which also Section 619 is the section that really talks about the funding formula for extra accommodations that are afforded to a very narrow transition point, a very sensitive transition point that doesn't get a lot of attention, and that is the 3 to 5 age range. So you make lots of early transitions, birth to 3 ages out. Some states, it's an option for the states to extend up to the age of 4 years old, right? And then for families who choose to opt, that means they can stay in Part C if their state accommodates and if the child is eligible. So when under Part C, I know we're probably going to get into the IEP, but there's also the IFSP, which is under Part C, which is the Individualized Family Service Plan, which is the similar like a IEP, but for the very, very young kids. And yeah, I think that's what I want to add to it. I mean, there's a lot of action, there's a lot of advocacy that happens every time the IDEA is reauthorized. The IDEA was supposed to be reauthorized in 2015, and I think it stalled. But no one wants it to be reauthorized right now because, there's just a lot of things that are happening under the the Trump administration with Secretary DeVos, which she's already rescinded 57 guidelines that give states support on how to interpret the IDEA, which is a big, big law with a lot of protections, won by advocacy by parents just like us. And it has never fully been funded.
So essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, so the IDEA if I'm trying to understand this from like I'm just off the street and I have a family, I have a student with needs, but I don't know. But the IDEA is the guarantor of my student's right to an education. Is that correct?
Yes, but as long as the child meets eligibility, and eligibility under IDEA is set by the state. So every state has a different eligibility criteria. So similar to the healthcare side of things, there's a lot of fractured. So if a family moves from state to state, they have to prove eligibility, or they have to go through eligibility, or they have to meet eligibility over and again. And and as Joy had mentioned, every 3 years you have the opportunity to broker. I mean, you can literally call that at any time, but the triennial is the time when the states.
I think Chioma froze on us. We'll see if we get her back. Joy, did you want to add anything about the IDEA?
Not at this time, but I can talk more about the IEP.
So within the IDEA, if we can go back to the PowerPoint, within the IDEA was something called FAPE, and FAPE gets a lot of talk. So as FAPE comes up here, so it's the free, appropriately ambitious public education. So it's a mandate under the IDEA law. School districts must give students with disabilities the opportunity to have an appropriately ambitious public education. So when I hear that, what that seems to mean to me is that in the past or now, if a student has needs, then automatically, kind of like almost what they tried to do with Leo, they over assume the needs that he'll need. So we say no. An appropriately ambitious public education means that we want them to be rigorous but also supportive. Do I have an understanding of FAPE correctly, Chioma?
Yes. So FAPE is actually a low bar, right? It's free, appropriate. Well, under the 2004 reauthorization, it's free, appropriate public education, not free and excellent, not free and magnificent, not free and what your child deserves, right? But free and appropriate, which is a low bar. But the appropriately ambitious, which is what we can use now, even legally, it's a legally accepted way to refer to what a child deserves, came out of a 2017 landmark case in the Supreme Court, Andrews F. Case, that was a child with autism in Colorado that the family wanted accommodations that were not being able to be met in their school district. And I forget the details of the case, but it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And at that point, when it was a unanimous vote, 8-1, all the justices, agreed that this was a case that needed to be met. And the main issue around the case, without getting much into the details, is the level of accommodations that a child needs to succeed in any school district. So it became free, appropriately ambitious, as was stated by Chief Justice Roberts in his statement, closing statements, when the case was won. So what that means is that any parent can go into an IEP meeting, and yes, it is supposed to be the state education agency that regulates what happens at the districts and how they interpret and how they enforce, your IDEA rights. But historically, we know that it's parents that sued, that went all the way to the Supreme Court. It was the parents in Andrews F. case. And so that ruling saying that a child is not just entitled to the bare minimum services, a child is entitled to appropriately ambitious, as in you can't just put like crazy IEP goals that either may not be measurable or may not even be something that fits the need of the child. I've literally seen IEPs where they're cut and paste, right? Because the school teams are so exhausted that they just cut and paste the information from one IEP to the other, and somebody cut and paste something into my child's IEP that was not, and with the child's name in my child's IEP that I only caught in a draft. Well, free, appropriately ambitious also really signifies what a family can do when they have a dispute. And dispute resolution is really big with one of the protected rights. And not every state has a fleshed out, defined due process that you can go through when you have a dispute as to what should go in the IEP, if your child is not learning, if your child is not meeting their goals, if the goals aren't ambitious enough, if you did not participate. This free appropriate really opens up a whole avenue of arguments that families can make to support that their child's learning be not just appropriate, but be appropriately ambitious.
When you say these things, I have to hold back, right? Because when I think about these things, I think about how, like, in this country, there is no federal guarantee to an education. It's not in the Constitution. No citizen by the federal government is entitled to an education. Now, every state does, right? Every state has a mandate for education, and therefore the 14th Amendment is supposed to ensure that everyone has access. But access versus access to quality are two completely different things. And we will definitely be talking about that as we go on. Now, I think what we have up next is the actual IEP. I believe that's the next thing we're going to talk about. This. Yes. So the IEP, this is probably the most well-known of the special education terminology, the IEP, the Individualized Education Program. I'll just go through a little bit, and then Joy, why don't you jump in with the IEP? So it's a legally binding document. I think it's super important. It is a legally binding document that describes a student's current academic level, yearly academic goal, the accommodations that they are allowed, the educational program in which they are enrolled, and then the additional services that they may receive. So for instance, my son Leo, he has an IEP. He has his current present level of performance, right? He might be reading, he's in second grade. So he might be reading on a first grade and 9-month level, doing math at a 2 second grade and 3rd month level, something like that. The goals are what we want him to do a year from now. A year from now, this is what we want Leo to be able to accomplish. The accommodations, those are the strategies that students may get to ensure their success. Extended wait time, one-on-one lunch bunch, therapies or counseling. That's what he could receive in school. The academic program is, where does the student go to class? Is it full immersion? Is it hybrid? Is it self-contained? And the additional services or any services that they may receive outside of school. In a nutshell, that is the information that is contained within the IEP. Joy, what else should we know?
So as we know that the IEP is a contract, and it is the parent's job to hold the school accountable. So when I explained my situation going to school growing up, and we kept asking for certain things because first off, I have a disability. You're supposed to accommodate me. But the school, Oakland School District, wasn't able to provide me my accommodation. What my mom didn't know was that she could take it up in a legal way, but instead she just chose another way and just went to another school district that had better services. So what IEP is, like he said, it has your goal, where you're at, but most importantly is the part about the accommodation, because I'm going to give my daughter's story for example. When they went in 3rd grade, they labeled her as on the spectrum. And even though I kept arguing with them, I knew my rights as a parent. I had to advocate for my child. And so they kept saying, whatever, this is why she falls on the spectrum. And I said, but did you ask her why she plays by herself? And they was like, no, we don't care. And I'm like, well, you need to see her interact outside of school then, because she's a different person. And so it was a lot of me back and forth. I wasn't going to let them dictate to me about my child. And so when they went ahead and said, we're going to say she has it, and they didn't care about what I had to say, I said, well, fine. You say that she has it, that means I want you to provide all the services that a student with autism would get, whether that's extra time, one-on-one, speech therapy, everything that has to go with it. You're going to provide that for her, because I knew now that's their that's their way of when we sign this document, that is a contract, and you hold on to this contract. This is something that you will hold on to. And then 3 years later, when she went to the other school and it was time for her triennial, even though I got her IEP because she went from a charter to a regular public school, it was some mess up. I had to go pick up her IEP. They usually don't give it to the parents. They have to send it certified because it is a contract. But fortunately, they knew I took care of business. So when I delivered her IEP and we had an initial meeting for her new school so we can see what kind of services she needed, fortunately, the team, and it's a team of, it's the principal or someone from administration, a special ed specialist, a speech therapist, a resource teacher, school psychiatrist. It's definitely a team of all of these people, because they can't just have one person. They have to have all the different specialties that are part of a special ed team. And so they had did their research for the initial meeting. And so they said, so they labeled her autistic because she didn't want to play with the other girls. I said, yes. But that made me feel good, that knowing that now I have a team that was going to support me and contest what I was saying. So, so she tested, and then they found, like I said, they found out she didn't have autism. They closed out her case for an IEP. They said she didn't need special ed services. And so that's what I mean by advocating. I didn't say she didn't have a disability, but you're misdiagnosing her. So, when you have something on paper, that is your proof that either the school is going against your wishes, or they're not doing what they're supposed to do as you sign it. So the power is really in your hands as the parent with the IEP. It's not them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joy. And Chioma, I'm going to want you to chime in. We are getting some word that questions are coming through. So as those questions get fed to us, we will address them. Chioma, what did you want to say about IEP?
Yeah, so similar to Joy, I've had those experiences. I think that yes, a parent has a lot of rights when it comes to the IEPs, right? Like, and IFSPs if it's in early childhood, right? So, I mean, the key thing I think to recognize is that the IEP is probably the most articulate document in education that demonstrates the parental rights. The parent has a right at every step of the way. The parent has a right to refuse the IEP. The parent has a right to dispute the classification of the IEP. The parent can reject the initial evaluation and request for an individual an IEE, which is an individual education evaluation, which is you can get an outside evaluation at the cost of the school district. But the challenge with that is that if the child comes back with a similar diagnosis or their situation is confirmed, the school can take you to due process and then sue you for malpractice. So, but it's a risky right, but there are many nuances that, unfortunately, in terms of being able to exercise your rights, as one of our PAT fellows loves to say, it's so true. Like, you shouldn't need to go to law school in order to understand the aspects of the IEP. You shouldn't need to be a professional advocate. You should just be able to be presented. Schools usually throw at you this the procedural safeguards book and say, hey, we've done our due diligence. Now you know your rights. But they're usually in inaccessible language, and they don't really express how much power you have. The IEP cannot be renewed without your signature and your presence. Sometimes schools will sign on behalf of the parent, especially if it's a low-income family or a second language English-speaking family that may not know their rights. And they're like, oh, we tried to invite you to the IEP meeting and you didn't show up. So we just went ahead and signed it for you, right? But a more empowered parent should not sign until they are completely satisfied and they are part of the team. So the parent is part of the IEP team. And the most ideal, the most evidence-based practices around disability services, they show that interdisciplinary practices are the best way to come at any one decision when it comes to the rights of a person with a disability, which is why the IEP is a body, a living body that requires you to come into that multidisciplinary team meeting, to come at agreements with a different expertise. And yes, a parent is an expertise on that meeting. Parenting is an expertise. So you have an expertise that requires knowledge to inform the IEP. The difference, the parent does have disproportionate rights in terms of approving that document, but why people think that IEP is a disempowering document is usually because you don't know your rights. You don't know how much rights you have. You don't know your rights to dispute. You don't know your rights to wait. You don't know your rights to request something different. So without really knowing all those rights, it's very hard to enforce the power that parents have using the IEP as a platform to ensure that your kid gets what they need to survive the education system.
So there was a question that came in. If a parent says, I'm not with this, I'm not signing it, and the district just says, okay, and it goes through it anyway, what's the recourse? What happens then?
The district cannot just move forward anyways. What the district can do, and if the district tries to do that, you have a right to sue, right? You have a right for due process, right? That's a violation of your parental rights. But then again, if you don't know your rights, you may not be able to manage a due process case. And if in your state, this happens a lot, right? Like I said, to disadvantaged communities. But the thing is, objectively speaking, they should never enforce an IEP that was not endorsed by the parent. They should never, or the child, if the child is now 18 years old. So that should never happen. Now, what the schools may try to do is sue you for educational malpractice. If it's clear to them that your child requires accommodations and they insist on the child receiving special education services. And I just want to say that IEP, in terms of the accommodations of self-contained and not self-contained, that's about the hours on the IEP. And that has to you first have to be given your rights of LRE, the least restrictive environment, which we're going to get to. But, location has nothing to do with accommodation. So lots of parents don't know that. Lots of parents don't know that you could be entitled to any kind of accommodation on the IEP, and the location of services is a secondary factor, which is based on the LRE and not FAPE. FAPE says my child is entitled to free and appropriate public education. Now, a parent who may not know this and know that it is actually in their best interest to sign the IEP may hold out and deny their child, and their child gets denied services. And the school may just go along with it until the child gets to high school. I've supported families up to the 12th grade where the kid cannot read. And I'm wondering, all the families along the way, like, who did not pick up the child cannot read? But then you also have cases where a parent will say, no, I opt out, and the school decides to pursue you legally. So it's a power question. It's an access question, and it's everything, as Joy said, is based on how much knowledge and how much grit the parent has to sustain a fight with an education system. Because as you guys know, those could be very, very intimidating spaces. You got to come in, ready for war, right? And if you're not the kind of parent that can hold your ground and say like, this is what is going to happen, this is what's not going to happen, and I'm just, this is my child, and I know my rights, or I know enough to know that what you're telling me is not okay, then you will end up signing away a lot of power that the law actually provides for you, including not signing an IEP, not receiving IEP services.
Go ahead, Joy.
Yeah, I want to say I saw a question about the signature just means that the parent attended the meeting, but that meaning can be confusing. So yes, in the beginning of the meeting of an IEP, yes, you do sign a document saying you're present, but that is the top of the page, and it should be worded clearly that it just means that you are here at the meeting. You don't sign the actual document until you went through every single thing, every single goal, and what the new goal is, or maybe they completed that goal. You don't sign that until the end of the goal. But yes, there are two different signature pages, and it should be worded that means that this person is present. And then at the end, this means that you agree with the services or whatever it says. But you just make sure, and that's the thing, read, take your time. You know what? A lot of us take off work to go to these meetings. So you know what? Take your time and read it. It is a contract. And if you're not sure, I mean, hopefully by after a year or two, you kind of know the process. You'll just be like, okay, you know what to look for, but take your time and read the document because you may be signing over something. So just, don't be in a hurry, forget their time, whatever. They getting paid to be there. So no, it's you. And then that's the other thing. Don't let them schedule when it's convenient for them. You make sure they schedule it when it's convenient for you. Just just show them that, because a lot of us that meeting can take 1 or 2 hours. And if you're a parent who's working and you can't really take off, no, so make sure that you're in control of this meeting. Don't let them dictate the whole meeting to you. Don't.
Chioma, you wanted to jump in on the signature question.
Yeah. I want to say a few things. That and so to Joy's last point about the IEP happening at a time that works for you, that is absolutely, you're right. Like you should never be bullied into an IEP meeting at a time that's not convenient for you. The team has to convene with all the parties that you need there to be able to meet, and that can happen over the phone. But I think I just advise families to show up in person, especially if there are things that you really want to see happen on that IEP, and it's not just a pass by kind of situation. I also want to say that a family has, under the IDEA, a family has rights to what's called a prior written notice. So they call it, so sometimes a prior written notice is said and it means after, but in the case of the IEP meeting, you're entitled to receiving the draft of the IEP at least 5 days before the meeting. So you should never come into a meeting, an IEP meeting, and your first view is in that meeting. I mean, that's a technical violation, and that is, due process state complaint worthy. There are two kinds of complaints you can file: a state complaint and a due process complaint in DC. And what this has to do with the signature is that these all become technical errors as well. There are different things that families can use in order to ensure that their state or their school district is really abiding by the law. And if the laws are not clearly stated in your state, then it is really important that you document everything, you email everything. Again, another way to protect your rights is if they say, oh, just sign because your name should go on the line and it's just for attendance. Sure, you can sign, but right next to your name, it should say only attendance approval, right? You can make that explicit if you are feeling the pressure, right, to sign that you at least came, especially if there's a suggestion that you don't show up for IEP meetings, right? Like, the other thing that you can do is that you follow up in an email, and you should just make a practice. I made a practice of this. I advise any family, any family that I support, one of the things that I encourage them to do is to, follow up in an email and say, hey, at the IEP meeting, we discussed X, Y, and Z. My understanding is that the amendments on the IEP that we discussed are going to be X, Y, and Z. And by the way, just to be clear, that you said that, by me signing, it by no way means that I am signing approval of this IEP. It's strictly to note my attendance. And you can do that in a very friendly way. I just say it also does not pay to be antagonistic, because at the end of the day, again, depending on the state and depending on your capacity, you may want to be more diplomatic in certain instances. Like, you have a lot of rights, but choose your battles. So sometimes you want to disarm them by not alarming them that you are documenting for your records, right? Like, but just make it a something that you always do. Then they will never suspect that you're building a case until you're ready to announce that you're building a case. So you have to be very strategic, especially if you're in an environment where you're not well protected. So the sign-in is a big deal, but there are protections against if you did sign and you didn't know what that meant.
Thank you so much. We're getting word that we're getting a lot of questions, which is beautiful. One thing we want to name is that our next episode is going to be about how to start advocating for your child. And what we're going to do is get all these questions and kind of formulate that session and response to that. So we may get to a few more questions in this episode, but please keep those questions coming, because our next episode is going to be all about how we start our advocacy for our children. One thing I want to make sure we get to is this idea of LRE. So in one of my roles, I support teachers, and very often we'll talk about special education, and you'll hear teachers say, well, why don't they just go to another classroom then, right? I can't teach them. They need to go to their special education classroom. And I love it when a teacher says that, because that gives me the opportunity to remind them that no, there is a civil right that you are violating if you say they need to go to another room. That is the least restrictive environment. Essentially, it's a key clause of the IDEA law. And again, Joy and Chioma are going to ensure that everything I say is either correct or corrected. But to the maximum extent appropriate. Children with disabilities are education. Children with disabilities get an education, or children with that their special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular education environment occurs only when the nature or severity of disability of a child is such that the education and regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. What I understand that to mean is that my student, my boy, Leo, has autism, has an IEP, has that. But he is entitled to the most rigorous and least restrictive environment possible for his education to happen. Therefore, if that means that he is in full immersion 100% of the time with extra supports, then that is his right. One thing that really triggers me about LRE is one, that it's personal. How the first thing a school said to us was like, well, we have a special education classroom for him. And to me, it's like, you have no idea who he is. You're already assuming that he can't thrive in full immersion. So I think LRE is also important for teachers, because every teacher needs to understand that whether or not you have a special education certificate hanging on your table, hanging on your wall, you are a special education teacher, because you have special education students in your classroom, period. And you need to ensure that you are reaching all of them. Joy and Chioma, what am I missing about LRE? What do we need to know?
So the history of the LRE is that, before, the reason why the IDEA was required in the first place was that public education, public schools were not allowing kids with disabilities to participate in in the school environment, period. So a lot of kids ended up going into these institutions. And in Washington, D.C., the most famous institution was Forest Haven, where a lot of kids were abused. They were violated. They were separated from their families, at very young ages, and they were kept in these very, very unsafe and unloving spaces. And they were not provided any opportunity to advance and be contributing members of society. And so there's a book that is really important that's written by Judy Heumann, who is one of the pillars of the disability rights movement that helped to pass the IDEA at that time through her organizing efforts. And the book's called Being Human, and she really outlines just the story behind the importance. LRE matches a key tenet of the greater movement for disability rights and disability justice. It is rearticulated in the Olmstead case that, RBG Justice Chief Justice Bader Ginsburg was really well known for supporting and ensuring that, that statement in the Olmstead case, which I think we're in the 100th year, not the 100th anniversary. This is a landmark year. I don't know what year it is for Olmstead, but we ended up getting the ADA. So you'll keep seeing the Americans with Disabilities Act, which also says that you have the right to be wherever you want in the community, and you have the right to independent living. You have the right to education in the least restrictive environment, because you have a right to exist in every space. It is a political statement as much as it is a legal statement. But even in saying that, I am very careful in terms of the LRE, because what works for one family does not necessarily work for the other. I'm a full believer in full inclusion. I believe in the aspiration of Olmstead, which is that we are able to be included in any space where we want to be included, where our families and our kids want to be included. But the caveat for that is that the appropriate accommodations are provided. So oftentimes I've seen it both ways. I've seen it in the way that you have seen it, Zach, and then in the way that, like, I don't want a self-contained classroom. I want my child accommodated in a general education setting. So that's that. And then, you may have to go through due process depending on the school. A large school district will play games like change your location, right? They were like, we can accommodate for your child in this school, but we can maybe accommodate for your child in that school, which interrupts another value, which is parental choice, right? Like, you want to have the right to choose what school your child gets to attend. So you trade off what works for you. I mean, there's also the reality that some parents do want their child in a smaller environment, in a more personalized environment. And there are ways that we can do inclusion, and we can have those smaller classrooms where they shouldn't just be for the special ed kid. There's some typically developing kids that need smaller environments, or that parents would prefer a smaller classroom environment. All spaces should be inclusive, including the self-contained, because, they're kids who may have disabilities but are not IEP eligible, because just because you have a disability doesn't mean that you are eligible for special education, depending on your state. So the LRE means a lot of things. In my personal case, my kids are currently in a more restrictive environment by my choice. That is because I have two Black sons navigating the District of Columbia public schools where I went to school. So I made an assessment with my family, and we said to ourselves, hey, listen, no Black child in this environment is learning, can read, can write. All their future are precarious, because that is just where we are in our city. And the public education sucks for many Black children. And here I have the opportunity to send it's not just an opportunity that's given to you. You literally have to fight for it. Depending on the state, you may not even have an option where there are really good private schools that you can try and get your child to go into, and the state pays for it. So, and the state may pay for it, then you still have to go to due process to get it. So, I had to fight to get my children's placement changed. I don't know. Sorry, can you hear me? I'm here.
Yep, go ahead.
I had to get my children's IEP changed to a restrictive environment. So that means that they had to have over 20 hours on their IEP services, which I had to build up. So even as I've seen kids who have really high needs, and yet the IEPs look like they don't have any real significant needs, which is another horrible end of the spectrum when it comes to accommodations and placement. So my kids now currently attend a non. I love it. It worked for my family. My son, who went in almost 2 years ago, he went in with severe behavior challenges. I mean, just because people say it's a thing does not mean just because it's my right environment. My child, if he's having a meltdown, if I'm coming in on surprise visits and watching them, I realized that my child is miserable in this environment. I had to make the tough decision to say that he should go first, and then his little brother went later into a more restrictive setting where I have seen bounds in his self-regulating, even during COVID. The son I have today and the son I had 2 years ago,
So it looks like we lost Chioma. We're running out of time, which is like the fastest hour ever. Joy, did you want to add anything before we plug our next episode?
Yeah, I want to add about I was also a special ed as inclusion aide in Berkeley, and Berkeley being like the front runner of disability rights, they believe in full inclusion. And so I was an aide, instructional assistant, and I was the one-on-one for students with various disabilities because they try to rotate us. But I worked with students with autism, maybe some cerebral palsy, Down syndrome. And I was there one-on-one. I would work with the teacher to help adapt their assignments and things like that. And with the full inclusion model, they would go check in with the special ed teacher for other subjects. But the full inclusion model was cool because it taught them how to be a part of the class and interact with other students. But I want to say we can talk about this in the next episode because this is a great topic in terms of there are a variety of services that can be provided for students with disabilities. And so we're going down the rabbit hole right now. So
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. This was like really so fast. So the thread that I'm seeing through all of this is familial empowerment, that we need to empower families so they know their rights, can advocate for their rights, and get the justice that they need for their families. So our next episode is coming up in about 2 weeks. We're going to do this every 2 weeks. So our next episode is going to be about how to begin advocating for your child, how to begin the journey that once you start, it doesn't really end. So how do we begin that? That will be a Monday, August 26th, same time, same place. So one of the things that would really help us is if you send us any feedback, scenarios, questions, situations that folks are going through that we can address. And that's what is coming down the pipe. Follow us on Twitter, follow our work, and we are going to fight for families and keep the work going. Chioma, Joy, thank you so much. The work is just getting started, and we'll see everybody in a couple of weeks.